Welcome back, everyone. This is part 2 of Unit 2 on audience-specific communication of climate change. You just completed an exercise in getting to know an audience of your choice. And that was basically to enact this first rule of effective communication. Know your audience. It is the overriding, all-important rule in making your communication effective. If you do not know who you're talking to and what they care about, it's incredibly rare that you actually get lucky enough to meet your goal. So the whole point of this is that you get better at identifying that, and what you practice is just with one exercise. I'm asking you and recommend to you that next time you give a talk, you spend at least some time thinking through the kinds of questions that were in the worksheet. So I'm going to now move us into this next step of, so what do you want to achieve when you talk to them? What's your goal? And as you will see, this is a bit of an iteration. So for a moment, just think along with me. What is the change you want to see happen? And then once you think about that, who can make the biggest difference to help you make that happen? And so then therefore, are the people that you picked for your audience, are they really the ones, or is it someone else? You might think of any number of examples of where it's not necessarily the case, right? So for example, if you are interested in seeing some kind of change in behavior in how hotels save energy or save water or anything like that, then you might want to reach, your first thinking was, well, I'm going to have to reach the managers of every single hotel in Seychelles. And then you think about this more and how challenging that is. And the question of who can make the biggest difference is really interesting then. Is it really every single manager? Or is it maybe a government official who can put in place a regulation, a mandate that they should, which they then have to follow? Well, that changes your audience rather completely, doesn't it? Then it becomes a matter of, you have to think about that policymaker and that regulator who could make that choice. And so that would be your primary audience, actually. Or alternatively, you might say, well, I don't want to go all the way as heavy-handed as, with a regulation or a mandate from top down. What if we found some respected leaders in the hotel community and let them take care of modeling and sort of, if you will, creating that social norm? We talked about that in our Zoom meeting today, right? Sometimes the social norm can get in the way because nobody sees anybody acting on something. And other times you actually can make use of a social norm by, basically suggesting, hey, it must be, something that we all should do because our leaders are doing it. The people we trust are doing it. More and more of the hotel owners are doing it. So maybe then your primary audience are those key influentials in the, business community, in the hotel community who might model for us, and then others will follow. So that's what I mean by iterating. And of course, as you can see, all of a sudden your goal might be slightly different too, right? You might then have a revised goal that's specific to that primary audience, even if your ultimate goal of getting the behavior changed of each of these hotels is still in the background. So that's what I mean by iterating between goal and audience. Now, what kind of goals? I want to put them into a few big bins to help you at least sort of categorically think about it, but I want you ultimately to get very specific with this. The first goal or type of goal, big bin, is that you simply want people to know something. You want to inform and educate. You want them to understand. And, that's a valid, important thing. This is why we send our kids to, to school, right? This is an important outcome that you might want to achieve. But that does not translate into people actually doing something. So that falls into the next category, which I would call mobilizing people to action. We already talked about in Unit 1 about this persistent notion of the information deficit model that assumes that if people only knew what I knew, then they would act. Well, as I said then, and I will repeat it many times, there is no good evidence that just because people know something, they will also act on it. So if you really want to see people to action, and many of you said this in your pre-training survey, you might want to think about, well, what kind of action? Is it like you want them to come to a public consultation event, or do you want them truly to be actively involved in developing an adaptation plan, making decisions in a group, in a business? Do you want them just to simply get behind a big high-level policy, something you might work toward for the next election or something like that? Or do you maybe want them to take a personal action or an action that affects their business operations or something like that? Again, that can fall into a category of dealing more with the emission side, so the mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions, or reducing the risks and vulnerabilities from climate change impacts. There's a third category I want to put on the table, which tends to be the most difficult one, and that is to actually think about really deeper changes. Many of you have noticed in your comments on the kinds of changes you're already seeing that the adaptations people are taking, even the mitigation action that Seychelles alone can take, is not going to fundamentally change the risks you face from sea level rise and the other changes from climate change. There might be some truly transformative, deep systemic changes in, say, your food systems or where you live, how you create your safety in your communities. So transformative changes may very well be on the horizon. How do you begin having that conversation? Or you might orient, toward helping people shift in their deeply held beliefs and views of the world and views of this issue, views of each other, the values from maybe being selfish and individualistic to something more egalitarian and oriented toward the common good. So these are just big bins. I want you to be far more specific when you get to thinking about a goal, but this is just to help us orient. So I'm going to ask you to continue with this exercise 4 that you began, and you saw that there was a back page, a last page on the in that package, where I want you to think about a concrete goal for the audience you have identified. What is it exactly you want them to do after you're done talking or after a long consultation process or whatever the case may be? Is it that they just need to understand something, or do you want them to do something differently? Do you want them to be politically engaged, civically engaged, that sort of thing? Can you specify that? So I want these hotel owners to, by such and such date, have changed every boiler in the, water boiler, whatever, in the hotel establishment. Something of that nature. That would be a specific type of goal. And I want you then to think together with your partner, who are the best people to make that change? Is there maybe a sequence? First, we need to achieve this, and then this, and then this, and then this to get to it, right? And so do you need other people then to get engaged in making that happen? So again, I want you to be as specific as possible, and let me, before you go back to that exercise, take you a little bit further down that road. This getting from your initial audience to your primary audience is really a question about, well, who makes those decisions? Who actually takes the necessary actions or can, shift the gears in a way that other people take that action? Who has the power to make those choices? Who are the influentials? Peter mentioned today in the conversation is in our Zoom meeting, that the conversation in climate change is so often deep polarized. And here's a question then. Is there someone in that context that you're interested in who could help depolarize? Is there someone who can model for others how to do this? That's the kind of people that you're interested in. I want to talk a little bit more about who these influentials or opinion leaders are. I think this is really interesting to think about. What makes someone an opinion leader? You might think about this for a moment to yourself. Like, who do you trust? Who do you look to when you're not so sure yourself? You know, take the coronavirus example right now. Who do you trust to know anything? Who do you call up? Well, sometimes it's because certain people are just have the right expertise and competence. Either you know it because they're supposed to be in charge, or they have, shown that they know what to do. Maybe it's a matter of their position or their job, the actual job. So I'm working for the Department of Health. Maybe it's because you simply know how to reach them and you meet them and they're accessible to you and you can actually pick up the phone and just call them up. Sometimes an opinion leader or an influential is someone who actually controls who gets to know what. That could be a really interesting one. Think about that, both in formal terms and informal terms. So not just, the media, which is not one thing anyway, right? But different media outlets. Who controls what you know? Who do you trust in that department? Oftentimes, opinion leaders are really, really good at interpersonal skills and communication skills. They're good to look up to for a number of reasons. They really know what they're talking about. Or that's at least the best kind of opinion leader, when they know what they're talking about. And they also have values that you trust and that you maybe aspire to, that they're kind of a model for you. So I want you to think about that in your exercise. Who are those people in the context that you're interested in, with the audience you're interested to work with? Who are the real opinion leaders? And that's your primary audience. That's who you want to reach. So go back to that worksheet, and with the questions and here's just a sample of those questions that you find on that worksheet. Think through, what do you know about those people? It might be that you just need to tweak what you already pulled out, on that worksheet so far, because they're a subgroup within that. Maybe you need to take a new sheet and just do it for that particular primary audience. Okay, so do that, and I'm, encourage you here to just push the pause button, call each other up, and do that second part of exercise 4. And then when you come back, we will continue here. What we talked about so far is just with whom to what end. What is the goal? And I now want to turn to the question of how. And that brings me, as a first step in thinking about how, to the importance of how you frame that. How do you frame what you have to talk about? Well, let me give you first a definition of what I mean by framing. And I'll give you a definition in 2 different ways, just to give you an example of that you don't always just need words to explain what you mean. Look at this picture. A scene probably you have seen many, many times in outside your own window. Nice sunset. Now imagine, or look at that next version of it, when you put a frame around it. How does that look different to you now? Does it look different to you now? When I look at it, somehow this whole thing just became more ominous. Somehow heavier, something more significant is happening. It helps me focus. The colors are stronger somehow. I don't know, this might be a complete optical illusion, but that's what I see. What about this? Just look at the last 2. The difference a particular frame makes. In this one here, I'm totally drawn to this white area on the left-hand side. Somehow that all of a sudden stands out. So one thing you need to know about frames is that they shape what you see. They give a value or some tone, some emotional content to what you see, and they help you focus on one particular aspect. There is no way you can look out anywhere and not look at what you see through a frame. And that is the frame of your experience, the frame of your habits, the frame of your life. You cannot see the world without a frame. But you can use that frame to help others see what they otherwise might not see. Right? You might bring attention to something in a way that they would never see if they just looked at the picture on the left. Here's another way to look at that. There's an American poet named Jane Hirschfeld. She has a collection called After, published a few years ago, and in that she has this poem, short poem. When his ship first came to Australia, Cook wrote, the natives continued fishing without looking up, unable, it seems, to fear what was too large to be comprehended. Right? They didn't even have a way to understand what was this thing coming over the horizon. They couldn't even see it. Now you might be interested to know the title of this poem. Isn't that true? Isn't that how it is for so many of us? That we can't even quite put our minds around what this issue of global warming is? Your task as a communicator is to help people put a frame around it that they can relate to, that they can understand. So this whole issue becomes accessible. Now let me use words. Formally, we define framing as providing an interpretive lens through which an issue can be viewed and understood, or an act, process, structure, or style of presenting something to arrange for a purpose. And that's important, to arrange for a purpose. Your purpose is that goal that you just delineated with your audience. You give shape to it. You support to get a certain effect. Namely, you want them to do whatever it is you want them to do. There's a whole number of things we use to create frames. Language, metaphors, memes sometimes, or stories that resonate in the culture that people can relate to. It's also an issue around the messenger. Imagine you wanted to frame climate change as something that people in the faith community have to take seriously, but you have a scientist say it, or maybe a doctor. There's some weird disconnect there, right? But what if a minister, a pastor, some faith leader were to say that? All of a sudden the messenger is congruent with what he or she is saying. So the messenger is part of the framing. It helps you orient how to interpret what it is that's being said. Sometimes tone of voice, music, noise, imagery, icons, the coloring, how intense it is versus how bland the colors are, black and white versus color. Those kinds of things can all be used to that effect, right? To create a certain effect you want to have. Sometimes even gestures, something that people recognize almost symbolically of, say, being overwhelmed or being actively engaged. You would show that in a particular body language. And that's part of how you convey, without words, what you want to say. That's framing. In the supplementary materials, as you remember, we have these little icons here every time you can go to something in the Google folder. In the supplementary materials, I have a few examples for you, very short, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, that frame climate change in a whole different way and convey it in a whole different way. The first one is an example from a city in the US where climate change is discussed as a public health threat, particularly with an emphasis on heat. That might actually resonate with people right now quite a bit because, they're already in a frame of mind around health at this moment. And you see, I want you to look at that and to see what kind of people do they involve in this, what sceneries, what imagery is used to convey heat, that public health threats. You will see this is a rather poetic approach to conveying it. So just think about what's the impact of that this young man is speaking in sort of rap type voice. There's another example in that same folder, and it speaks to an outdoor activity Americans in particular love. It's fly fishing. I couldn't find one that's directly from your context, but you get the idea, right? It's a completely different way of talking about how climate change affects us personally. And to that effect, I want to point you to this beautiful short video, the interview we have with Patsy Atanaz, who as a reporter is always looking to look for these human interest stories, these ways of making climate change relevant to the lives and to the things people care about. In the story with the outdoor person, fisherman, you hear him talk what it means to him personally to go outside and be standing in the river and be silent for hours at a time. For him, it's going to church. It's his sacred activity. Now imagine that sacred activity is being affected by climate change. That's how he cares. That's what will make him care if his church is being affected, right? So I want you to just look at these and let it affect you. Think about how you feel very differently after one and another, and what elements did they use to make that work. And then I want you to call up your friend, your training partner, and talk about what difference a frame makes. I list here a few examples in the exercise that I'm giving you, exercise 5 in the Google folder. There are additional ones, and these are, things that resonate here for different audiences. And I want you to think about what audiences they might resonate with, and what elements, if you were to make a little movie like this, what elements would you want to include in that communication? Who would feature as speakers or as people playing in that? What kind of language would work? Just be creative. Think about it for a little bit. What kind of language might resonate? So I want you to play with that, and I had a few extra lines there in that table, and I just want you to think through, are there some other ones, other frames that might really resonate with people in Seychelles? Just something that isn't on this list that you find might really work. So I want you to go do that and then come back to this. But the point here about framing is that framing makes an issue accessible, and it makes it relevant to different people. Look at these 3 scenes, and imagine you would have to speak about coastal erosion to families with children, to a coastal planner, or to a tourist. Framing the issue of coastal erosion for these three different individuals or groups of people, you would have to really think hard. How do you talk about it that it becomes relevant to them? Or think about this here. You have an advocate, maybe an electric utility person, and the harbor master. And you would somehow have to talk to them about wind power. How would you do that? What would resonate with those different kinds of people? Or in the last example here, again, an erosion issue, you mention it, someone in a hotel, someone who's a coastal engineer, and a coastal homeowner. What would resonate with them? What would they want to know? Why would they even listen to you, give you the time of day? It's got to be something that resonates with that particular group. So if you can find an overarching frame to make something intelligible, accessible, and relevant to that group, you have gotten the kernel of how to communicate. Now, you might say, well, there might be 10 ways to talk to an engineer or a planner or a tourist. True enough. So we have a little rule here, which is the rule of 3 A's to pick what's a good frame to use. I'm going to walk you through it. The first A stands for availability. And what is meant by that is the ease with which an issue or examples of it come to mind based on how frequently the audience encounters it. So let me give you an example of that. Say you're using this phrase, we got to weather the storm. Well, if you just recently had a storm, that'll go over really easily, right? It's really available to people because they just had that experience. If you're in the middle of summer and you talk to people about winter problems, not so easy. If you haven't had a storm in 3 seasons, maybe that's not the best way to talk about it. Or if you're talking to young people and you're trying to get them to do some energy efficiency behavior or something, keep it cool, dude, that might work really well. Might not work with your grandmother. You get what I'm talking about, right? Is it something that they're so familiar with? It's so common in their experience that they can very quickly get it to the top of their mind what you mean, what you're referring to. That's availability. The next one is accessibility, slightly different, and that is the readiness with which a construct is used in information processing. Now, let me give you an example of that. So right now, for example, almost everything we do in daily life is about public health. If you want people to think about preparedness and you relate it in some ways to what we do in public health, that might actually really work right now, because it's just, yeah. What else? I mean, is there any other way to think about it is probably what these people will ask you. Or something slightly different is an example like leaving a better future for our children. In America, this is a very common phrase, even though we don't live it, quite frankly, but it is at least a common cultural meme to think in these terms. And it's, everyone grows up with it. It's very accessible to people. So if maybe you want to frame or have a frame that alludes to this idea of leaving a better future for your children, that would work because it's culturally present, right? It's not present because it just happened. It's culturally present. And the last one is the applicability, the relevance and appropriateness of stored information to the issue at hand. So again, let me explain that in an example. So for example, the notion of creation care, a phrase that's used here commonly of what motivates faith-based communities to engage on issues of the environment and climate change. So if you want to get them to do something that's environmental protection oriented or that focuses on the least among us, taking care of those who are most vulnerable, then you have a context in that community that already thinks in these terms and for whom this is absolutely applicable. There's like no disruption at all in thinking what they think in church to what they think or in temple to what you want them to do. It is directly applicable. If you're asking, if you go back to that example of the coastal engineer and you ask that engineer to do creation care, whoa, that just doesn't compute, right? It is so a disconnect from their daily life. But if you ask an engineer about building for the future, creating a robust future, there's no interruption. It is completely consistent and contiguous from where they are in their daily brains in their lives anyway to what you want them to do. So I want you to think through, when you get to the exercise of developing and picking a good frame, check them against the 3 A's. Is it available to people? Is it accessible? And is it applicable? Now, I want to distinguish what a frame is from what a mental model is. It's a term you probably have heard of quite a bit before, and it is related to frames and they can be consistent, but they're not the same thing. So if the frame was this big container, if you will, in which you present something, what you present, what's inside that container, might include a mental model. And that is a way to help people understand a new bit of information through a particular lens or a particular construct that they're already familiar with. It's actually the alpha and omega of all education, right? That we oftentimes take up new information through something that we already know. So in this instance here, the way to define it is a kind of an internal representation of an external reality, or as I like to think of it, as a mental shortcut to quickly make sense of new information. Let me give you a couple of examples, and they are in those pictures on the right-hand side. Remember when we talked about climate change as something having to do with the greenhouse effect? Well, the greenhouse is that mental model, right? We wanted to explain to people that because of the pollution we put in the air, heat gets trapped just like it is with, sitting in a greenhouse. When you're in there and it's warm outside, it's sunny outside, it is far warmer inside that greenhouse than outside. So you've just given people a way to understand what this warming effect that they can't quite comprehend otherwise, what that is like. A lot of people understand climate change, or did way back when, through the lens of the ozone layer. And it's like, what? Yeah. Well, why is that? Because the ozone layer was the first global atmospheric problem that we discussed in public. It happened, in the early 80s, before we talked about climate change, about the greenhouse effect. And so when, there was another atmospheric problem, they dug in their brains and like, oh, there was another thing. Oh, wasn't it about the ozone hole? Okay, so the way they then tried to understand global warming is they thought there's a hole in the ozone layer at the top of the planet, more heat goes in through it, and that's why it warms up. You understand why they did it, right? Why they think it. They use something that's familiar to them to understand something that's not yet familiar. It was wrong. It was not the correct way of representing external reality through that particular model. But that's how people often got confused about those two things. Or the issue of pollution. When you say pollution to someone, people see dirt, people see smokestacks, see tailpipes, and they get that that's bad. And somehow understanding global warming through the lens of air pollution helped them understand it was a bad thing. So you get the idea of how a mental model can help you understand something new. Oftentimes it gives explanatory power of how something works, and it's actually one of the most important aspects of the use or the uses of a mental model. So the ones that I showed you here, greenhouse effect, ozone layer, pollution, have been shown to not be super effective with helping people understand how climate change works and what happens. What people have begun to test and to see is that when you help people understand that emissions create a kind of a heat trapping blanket around the planet, and that therefore it gets warmer and warmer, that tends to help people understand what we're doing, and that it's not a good idea to keep thickening that blanket around us. So you see in this example how there is an explanation of the mechanism of how emissions relate to warming and relate to overheating, not a good thing. So it's very important to pick the right kind of metaphor or mental model to help people understand how it works, so that they're predisposed to certain behaviors and solutions and understand how it works. One of the reasons why pollution doesn't work as well, I'll give you that just to sort of add to that, is that what we've learned is when there's pollution, you put something on the tailpipe, you put something on the smokestack, you put a filter on the water, and then it stops. It's gone. Well, with climate change, that won't happen, right? We will reduce emissions even radically, and there's going to be continued warming in the Earth system, in part because of the storage of the heat in the oceans that will be re-released, and all the commitments, if you will, that we have made, right? So it kind of misleads to think of climate change emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, as air pollutants, because the problem doesn't quite go away just by us, reducing those emissions. So got to be careful about that, but they are super helpful as sort of shortcuts and as simplifying metaphors to help people understand something very complex. Now, the third concept I want you to understand and get a sense of is messages. Now, that's simply what's the most important thing for your audience to hear. You know so much about this issue. You know so much about any number of issues. Now, what of all of that do you want to actually convey to the audience that you have chosen? I want to contrast here a little bit how scientists think and communicate, tend to, and how the public thinks and what they care about, and oftentimes how reporter work in communication. So a scientist will give you all the background information, will explain all the basics. They will give you supporting details. They will couch it in however much uncertainty buffers we need to put around it, and then they will conclude with the result and conclusions, and that's it. The public, when you come like with that kind of information to the public, you will have lost them probably a quarter through the background information. The public tends to want to know the bottom line first, and then, so what does that mean, and how do we get there, and why do we think that? And then if you really got their interest, they might want to know some more supportive details. Basically, the result, conclusion, or implications and the bottom line of something, that is where the message sits. Everything else is supporting material. And that can be super helpful because it reinforces what you have to say. But your key message is what's at the tip of that triangle. And that's what I want you to focus on. For the specific audience that you have chosen, what do you want them to do? What do you want them to hear? What do they need to hear? What are their questions that you need to answer with whatever small window of time you have to communicate? You might have an hour-long meeting. Bless your heart when you do. Most of them will only pay attention to you for about 7 seconds. What can you say in 7 seconds, in 2 minutes, to get across to them? I want to give you an example and actually point you to another one of these short videos. It's just, I think, 2.5, 3 minutes long in the supplementary materials. And it's an example of my own, where I was interviewed after I was the lead author on a coastal chapter for the U.S. National Climate Assessment a few years ago. And there are 3 messages in that short video that you hear about again and again. And by all means, you feel free to criticize. It's not the best of my own work. But I do come back again and again in what I say to basically 3 things I want the audience to know. The first one is that the U.S. coastline is crucially important to every American. Even if you live inland, it's important to you. And I then give lots of examples of how that is. The other thing I wanted them to take away from that little short interview is that the impacts of climate change and sea level rise that threaten our community and communities and way of life, they're not something of the future. They're now. They're here now. This is not something we can postpone. And the third one is that coastal communities are recognizing these threats and are actually doing something about them. A different way of putting it is, this matters to you. This is not about the future, it's about now. And adaptation is the social norm already. I was very conscious in wanting to create a social norm. Is it true that, of the, thousands and thousands and thousands of communities, coastal communities are already doing things? Not every single one. I would say by now, probably every single one is experiencing the impact, so it is not about the future. But I wanted to create the sense that others like you are doing something, in inverted commas, and so therefore you should too. I couldn't say that as a scientist. I couldn't tell anyone what they should do, but I could create a social norm, and we have plenty of evidence in the assessment actually saying so, of people doing work already on this. So this is an example, and I just invite you to go to that material and take a look and see, can you hear those 3 messages? And then I want you to get with your partner and think through, for the audience that you have chosen, what are some promising frames that work for them? Could be, each of you, there's 25 or so pairs of you. You come up with 25 different ways of talking about it. And that's perfectly fine because it ought to be audience specific. But I want you to check against the 3 A's, whatever your ideas are. Is it readily available to them? Is it accessible and applicable to the particular group that you're speaking to? What language might fit for them? Is there any language you shouldn't use because it might trigger them or it might just totally go flat? And I want you to be specific. And then after you've done that, I want you to think about, well, so now what would we want this group of people that we've chosen to know? What is it that they need to hear, take away? You know, if after seeing a 2-minute spot, what is the thing that you want them to remember tonight? Because that's probably how long they will remember it, until tonight, if you're lucky. So think about no more than 3 or 4 brief key messages. And I give you examples here of a message triangle for 3 messages or a message box for 4 messages. If you have more than 4, I can guarantee you they will not remember. And then think about, are there any sound bites or statistics or examples from, you know, that are relevant to your messages that you can add? So if you imagine you are in an interview with a reporter and you would have to, like, well, so okay, here's your key message, but show me how this is really true. And you would have to back that up with a few explanations or a few examples. And then I want you to get together again virtually, only virtually, to practice that. If you have, you know, not a lot of experience with that, write a little script. It's totally fine. Just how could you say what you want to say to that audience that you have chosen? Say you have 2 minutes with them in an elevator. That's a long elevator ride. Imagine you have 2 minutes at a bar or someplace, and you could get these 3 messages, 4 messages across. So practice then with your partner delivering and give each other feedback. You know, if you don't have to tell your partner ahead of time what your 3 messages are, the first bit of feedback could be, what messages did you hear? Did they come across? Did they hear what you want them to hear? And if not, why not? Is there a way to bring that out more clearly, more strongly, more forcefully? And if you have a lot of practice doing that, maybe one of you can act as the reporter and you get to be the interviewee and you get to practice. Or imagine you're maybe a little resistant audience of the type that you have chosen, and you're like, I don't know if I want to listen to this. And sort of, you know, you might push back. Can you come back to your messages as opposed to getting tracked down in details that the other person might take you in? Come back to the thing you really want to say. This is your chance to actually get that across. It's not a debate. This is not a dialogue. This is you coming across with your 3 messages. So practice that and take notes on how well it's going, and then we'll come back to that in our Zoom call. Okay, so with that, I want to give you a quick outlook to Unit 3 and what we'll do next week, and then we conclude. So first rule again, please adhere to all local regulations on social distancing. It's just ever so important to me that you don't put yourself at risk, but use all the possible communication media that are available to you to be in touch with your partner and to be in touch with us. Michelle has given you her email, her FaceTime, I think. I'm trying to remember, WhatsApp, anything that works. We're here. You can send emails to me, so we're happy to help in whatever might come up. A quick outlook to what we're doing is going to be very similar to what we did today, maybe some breakout groups to get everyone talking some more so we can get to know everyone. But it's going to be a focus on what your learning is, your experience, your challenges with the exercises that we did in this time. And, you know, if there's any more logistical issues, then we will bring those up. And please, again, send us your concerns, your questions, your issues ahead of time so we make sure we cover them. All is welcome. In terms of what we're going to do substantively, we'll have actually a beautiful next video with Patrick Victor, our guest speaker, for that particular unit, with wonderful music to come to support what we want to do in that particular session, which is to think more about how can we motivate people and what are the things that get in the way of people taking action? Can we address those emotional barriers, resistances, and challenges in effective ways. So we'll do that and again go around in this iterative way. Does that maybe suggest some needed changes to the things you want to say, or how you say it, or how you frame it? Are there more powerful ways to do that? Can you empower people to, feel like they are in charge of creating the future that they want? If there are any questions, again, send me material ahead of time. Send me any questions, concerns. I'm happy to make sure we cover them and address them in the coming units and in our upcoming Zoom discussion. And so with that, I want to just say one last thing, which is this week is the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. And I just want to say happy Earth, happy Earth Day, happy birthday Earth, which is probably more than 50 years. And just find a way to connect with Earth. If you have opportunities to go outside, if you are just sitting on your balcony, there are ways in which you can enjoy that we're here and what we get from it. So happy Earth Day to everyone, and I'll see you next week. Thank you so much. Stay safe.